Okay, and welcome to Rabbi Roth. I haven't seen Rabbi Roth in a few weeks, so it's always a pleasure. Okay,
Thank you.
so we were discussing the position of the Ramban on Yibum. So let me just catch us up.
Thank you.
Um, I'm actually not in my usual spot. I'm in the yeshiva because I'm speaking here at 9:30. So and I have to do something. But let's begin. So the Ramban was of the opinion that in his commentary on the Torah, that Yibum was actually practiced in the story of Yehuda and Tamar, meaning that Yehuda's son Er was married to Tamar. He died without leaving any children, and then Yehuda addressed his second son Onan and requested that he go and be miyabim Tamar lahakim zera liachicha in order to produce a child, presumably that would somehow be a benefit to the deceased brother. And Onan, who was a difficult character, as was Er, so he refused to do that. And consequently, Tamar kind of was in a limbo state. There was another son, Shelah, but he was either too young or Yehuda was hesitant, for him to immediately take the mantle of Yibum. So, excuse me, either way, there was a limbo period. And then, the story unfolds that, Yehuda mistook Tamar. He thought that she was, some stranger. He had a physical relationship with her. Then all of a sudden she showed up, as Tamar, and she was with child. She was pregnant. And everybody wanted to convict her of betraying, the Zika of the Yibum. And then finally, she, in a very delicate, very discreet, I would say, way, revealed that Yehuda was the father of this child. And he said, Tzadka hi mimeni, she's right, and I'm wrong. Yehuda was a very humble man, or was at least a very honest man. He took responsibility for his mistakes. And then the Torah says that, he went on with his life. Yeah. So anyway, the Ramban is of the opinion that Kodem Matan Torah, before Matan Torah, there was Yibum, and not only was there was a preferred Yibum among brothers, and that's why Yehuda initially turned to Onan and was going to turn to Shelah. But then on a secondary level, if there are no brothers or the brothers refuse to step up and do the Yibum, Kodem Matan Torah, before Matan Torah, a father could do Yibum as well. That is the position of the Ramban. What's curious is that the Ramban himself, not in his Perush on the Torah, but in his commentary on Masechet Yevamos, if you could turn to page, I'll give you the page number. It's page 6 in the Bar Makom, not the new ones, but the old ones. It's Chidush Ramban Masechet Yevamos Tzadi Chesam and Aleph. So there, the Ramban is talking about a different topic, but in the context of that topic, he brings up the Yehuda and Tamar story. So let me tell you what he's talking about. So a Ben Noach, a non-Jew, also has marriage, right? V'davak be'ishto, v'hayu l'basar echad. A non-Jew has, a marriage relationship. Moreover, there are certain arayos, there are certain illicit relationships that are prohibited to a Ben Noach as well. However, it's not so clear which illicit relationships exist. For example, for a Jew, they're all spelled out in Parshas Achrei Mos and a little bit in Kedoshim. We actually read on Yom Kippur at Mincha, we read the Parsha of Arayos, a strange choice. I'll try to explain why in a couple of minutes. I'll give you my take anyway. So that spells out all of the different, arayos, the illicit relationships, that Jew has to avoid. Do all of those relationships also apply to a non-Jew, to a Ben Noach from a Jewish law point of view? So one thing we know for certain is that in non-Jewish law, by the way, when I speak of non-Jewish law, just to make it perfectly clear, I'm not talking about how non-Jews behave. I'm talking about Judaism's preference for non-Jewish law, meaning the laws of Bnei Noach. So, according to dinim of Bnei Noach, or the laws of Bnei Noach, the status of family among Bnei Noach goes through the mother, not through the father. In other words, when it comes to brothers, sisters, etc., non-Jewish, Bnei Noach law only recognizes, all things being equal with one exception, the relatives of the mother, not of the father. The father, we have this principle that a father has no yichus when it comes to a ben Noach. It's very much a contrast, obviously, to Jewish law, because in Jewish law, the Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, what shevet you're from, all of that depends.
Well, assuming
all that depends on
assuming there lacks ways of dealing with things, the father, it could be anybody.
Right. That's one of the considerations for sure. And therefore, in mishpachas ha'em is a mishpacha. We say mishpachas ha'av kriya mishpacha, mishpachas ha'em lo kriya mishpacha. We already discussed the Gemara Yevamos Daf Chaf Daled Amud Aleph when it comes to Yerusha. But for Ben Noach, it's the opposite. So any relative on the father's side can never be in an erva because they're not really related. But the open question is, what about relatives through marriage? Does that apply to a Ben Noach? Bnei Noach have marriage. Do they also have an expansion of relatives vis-a-vis erva through marriage? For example, very simple, take the two cases that the Ramban discusses. One is daughters-in-law, and the other is a sister-in-law. But there are two types of sisters-in-law, right? One is
to the father or to the mother?
What? Oh, 1 second. No. Oh, I see. From the mother. Means sisters from the mother. Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah.
But forget about, before we get to that, meaning we're talking about what is the status for Ben Noach? Let's say Ben Noach's son, right? Is married. Okay? So that's his daughter-in-law. Is that an erva or not? Or let's say he's his wife. Better case. He's married to his wife, and his wife has a sister. Is that sister, that's a sister-in-law, is she prohibited to the Ben Noach as erva or not?
Would that depend on whether it's a chiddush according to logic or it's not?
Not necessarily.
One could say that the sister of your wife is somewhat of a chiddush as to the. I mean, it's not. Wouldn't hit you in the head that necessarily that's an erva like. And
it's an erva for a Jew for sure.
Torah actually tell you specifically, and then it's b'chayel. It's right. not the most natural first level.
Okay, right. So, but the question is, does it apply or not? So, if you look at the Ramban says something quite. I should just add. There's a question that the Rishonim argue about. The Yad Ramah in Sanhedrin says, if Bnei Noach have marriage and Bnei Noach have erva, then Bnei Noach have erva through marriage. Like, what's the problem? However, the Ramban disagrees. Ramban says that there is no erva through marriage. And this is what he says. V'huadin, if you look at the Ramban, nami barayus to ishus, kagon eshes krovim, to materis begiyusan, the gabi arayus kicha ksiva be, ve'inu kicha leislahu. So he says something very interesting. He says, if you look at the parsha in Achremos, the Torah uses the expression ki yikach, ish, isha, and she has a sister. It keeps using the expression yikach. Now we know that kicha signals marriage, right? And erusin in particular, not nesuin. Kicha mistear. This coming week's parsha Sky Yisara. is about the acquisition of the Oras HaMachpelah, and that's the source for Ki Yikach Isha and Kicha Kicha B'stei Ephraim, right? So Ramban says something quite amazing. He says, since the Torah, when it describes arayos through marriage, always uses the expression kicha, and there's no kicha for ben Noach. There's marriage, but there's no kicha. There's no erusin. There's no kiddushin. As we've discussed, ben Noach has straight nesuin. They don't have erusin kodem l'nesuin. So the Ramban says, therefore, since gabe arayos kicha ksibuhu, the inu, meaning bnei Noach, kicha leislahu, v'lo garmina mida ashkechan l'ishas ba'av the chidushu. The only one exception is a stepmother. There's a special limud that a person's stepmother, a ben Noach stepmother, is prohibited to him. But the Ramban says any other relative through marriage is not an erba. And then he says, how do I know this? So listen to this. V'harei Yaakov nasa shtei achios, because Yaakov Avinu married two sisters. Right, that's coming up in the parsha coming up, Rachel and Leah.
So that was Koda Matan Torah. How was he able to do that?
Yeah, so how was he able to do that? So this is actually very interesting.
But he paid a price. It's a self.
Koda Matan Torah doesn't help you so much, for the issue of Ben Noach, because if a Ben Noach is prohibited, that would even be before Matan Torah.
But actually, he paid a price for it. Yaakov. In other words, so it wasn't the free. You can get a free. What's it called?
Well, okay. So you again, you're a victim of your own, excellent knowledge. So what you're channeling is the Ramban, the Ramban al Torah. So the Ramban al Torah was concerned. Forget about how Yaakov could marry two sisters from a Ben Noach point of view. Don't we say that the Avos used to keep the mitzvahs of the Torah even before Matan Torah voluntarily? So how could Yaakov marry Rachel and Leah? So the Ramban came up with what we call an Einfall, like a great idea in his Perush al Torah. He says he married Rachel and Leah when he was in Chutz La'aretz. And according to the Ramban, the rule that the Avos conducted themselves according to Din Torah, even before Matan Torah, that was applied only in Eretz Yisrael, not in Chutz La'aretz. That's the Ramban's theory, and it's very consistent with the Ramban's broader view that Eretz Yisrael is, kind of a linchpin, even in regular mitzvos, and always has been. The Ramban is a very expansive view of the scope and centrality of Eretz Yisrael, and part of that is expressed in this Ramban. But if Ben Noach,
all mitzvah different only applied to Eretz Yisrael.
So the Ramban's saying that pre-Matan Torah, the Avos observed the mitzvos of the Torah only in Eretz Yisrael, but not in Chutz La'aretz. Since he married Rachel and Leah in Chutz La'aretz, and that I assume is what you were referring to about the price that he paid, because the Ramban explains that shortly after they entered into Eretz Yisrael, Rachel died. And according to the Ramban, he could not have continued to be married to these two sisters.
The Rambam is very difficult because I'm sure Yaakov could have figured this out, that he had to keep it in Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, that's a great point. But either way, that's what he said. Anyways, but the Ramban here says something else, and that is, if a Ben Noach is not allowed to marry his sister-in-law, meaning his wife's sister, then forget about Eretz Yisrael and forget about, pre-Matan Torah, post-Matan Torah. Just as a Ben Noach, he wouldn't have been allowed to. So you see from there that it is permissible for a Ben Noach to marry two sisters, because, says the Ramban, erva through marriage, kurva through marriage, doesn't exist for Ben Noach, only for Yisrael.
So what is the rationale for not being able to marry the stepmother? She's even a further relative.
Say that again?
What is the reason that there's a prohibition for the stepmother, who's even a more distant relative?
Oh, the stepmother. So I think, if you ask me, Again, they just say the Ramban just says it's Xeris Akasu. It's just a special.
All right, that answers it because
No. As you know, I try to, I'm not so. If that's all we can say, that's all we can say. We're all, Avdei Hashem, so we accept it. But if we can explain it, it's always a little better. If you want my explanation, I'll tell you what I think it is, and that is, it's not, and this is going to be relevant in a minute for something else. He's not prohibited to have a relationship with his stepmother. He's prohibited from having a relationship with his father's wife. What's the difference between, the father's wife, if it isn't his mother, is the stepmother. What I'm trying to emphasize is there are two ways to look at relationships through marriage. One is that it's like a bonding and binding, factor, meaning it expands the concept of korva, of relatives. So, if you're related to a relative and they're related to someone else, then somehow, sometimes that expands, korva itself. But then we would emphasize the fact that she's his stepmother. But in Psukim, it sounds like the bigger point is she's his father's wife, meaning the problem is it's undignified or it's embarrassing or it's, cruel.
That's the way it's expressed in Achimos, that you're doing an affront to your father's.
It's an affront to Knaf Aviv, to the father's dignity. So I think that's the idea. The idea is you're not related to any of your father's relatives, but you are related and still have to, express regard and respect for your father.
Is it
So
a
this is
Kibbutz
just
Av issue?
disrespect. What?
Kibbutz Av issue?
I don't know if it's Kibbutz Av or whatever it is, but there, for example, there's a Yerusha Dvar Torah. The Gemara says in Kiddushin Daf Yud Zayin that, Dvar Torah, there is Yerusha from a non-Jew can be Yorish, his father. So even though normally we say we're not sure or ein lo chayus, ein lo yichus, but there's still a relationship with the actual father. And therefore the idea that, it's improper to be involved with the person who he was married to makes sense. Okay. Well, but, the idea is that sisters, it's not a violation of the sister, it's a din of sister-in-law, and that doesn't exist. What about Kalaso, his daughter-in-law? So that's very interesting, because again, that's the wife of his son, right? So
Longer married to the son.
look what the Ramban says about this. He says, about Baharei Yehuda. Oh, by the way, let's finish up what he says about Yaakov. Yaakov nasa shtei achios v'ilmale hayasuros hayu chachamim tzrichen lefarish shelo hayu achios min ha'ein. He said there would have been a way out of it. You could have said they're sisters from the father and not from the mother. And for Benoach, that doesn't count. He said, but we never found anybody who said that. No one ever said that Leah and Rachel were the daughters of Lavan, but not both the daughters of Mrs. Lavan. So the Ramban says that's a proof. Now, but what about the next one? V'harei Yehuda Amar al Tamar Kalaso Tzadka Mimeni. This is very interesting. Tamar was Yehuda's daughter-in-law, right? She had been married to his son. And originally they wanted to punish her, right? And then he said, Tzadka Mimeni, I'm the one who had a relationship with her. Says the Ramban, V'ilo hoisa sura mishum kala akata chayevasi misa darayos. If a daughter-in-law is prohibited to a Benoach, then how was Yehuda able to justify a yibum with his daughter-in-law? She's prohibited to him.
There was also Zakuka with the other son, no?
One second. The pasuk says that he only had that one encounter and then he terminated his relationship with her. So the Ramban says that that's for a different reason. What you just said. Because meaning there was a better candidate for the Yibum, which he knew about. So maybe that's the reason that he ended the relationship.
Doesn't the Gemara say that if one jumps ahead of his turn, that it's an okay?
Yeah, but that's among brothers. That's not necessarily true when you're talking about a qualitative difference of brothers and a son, brothers and a father.
It's not clear before Matan Torah that there was a qualitative difference.
Right. No, but the Ramban makes it perfectly clear in his Perush al Torah, which I'm going to get back to in a second, that the preference was for brothers. Even then. Anyways, this is the Ramban's proof. But on the surface, it's not such a good proof, because the Ramban al Torah says that, like we were just talking, that Yehuda's relationship with Tamar was a Yibum relationship. Every Yibum involves violating an erva.
Yeah, but does it make a difference that he did not know he was trying to do Yibum?
No, that's not, that
No,
should add to the color of the story. But it's not, it doesn't make a legal difference.
The Gemara says, doesn't we have a mission that says, doesn't matter how it happens, Oneh, Shogeg, whatever.
Yeah.
So,
That's the Mishnah in the beginning of the fifth
so it
paragraph.
doesn't matter.
Yeah, so that's not a factor. But what is a factor, so look at the Rajba, the next entry. The Rajba quotes the Ramban, and then 3 lines down, he says, Umihu, Ein Tamar Raya. This is the 3rd line of the Chidushei Rajba. He says the Tamar proof is not a good proof. Dumuteres Haisala Lihuda, Dvar Torah, Mishum Yavama. Just like, what's a typical Yibum? A typical Yibum is a brother stepping in for his deceased brother who had no children. And even though there is an Isser of Eshes Ach of a sister-in-law, you're not allowed, if it wasn't for a Yibum situation, he wouldn't be allowed to be involved with his brother's wife. Nonetheless, the Yibum, we'll discuss exactly how this works, but on some level, the Yibum overrides the Isser, the Erva. So the Rajba says that's what happened with Yehuda and Tamar, especially according to the Ramban in this Perush al Torah. It was Yibum. So even if generally there is an Isser Kalaso, daughter-in-law, the fact that Yehuda didn't violate that isn't a proof because he did it as Yibum. Just like a brother doesn't violate Isser Eshes Ach in the context of
But
Yibum.
is that a correlation? Just because the Torah made an exemption by Eshes Ach doesn't mean it made an exemption by Kolosa.
Put it this way, there might be, you can understand the Rajba's argument.
There's a logic there, but it's not necessarily true.
Yeah. So let me say the following. So number one, you could say, well, before we even get to that, so the Rajba's considering the possibility that a Ben Noach does have a prohibition of kalaso. Why would that be? So maybe it's similar to what I said about the stepmother, but it's a little bit of a different category. Maybe maybe there's a certain yichus to kalaso, because we call it kalaso, we don't call it Eshes
Beno.
And not only that, how do we call every bride and every groom?
Chassan Kala.
Chassan and Kal. And I mentioned this in the past that, Chassan means really son-in-law, and Kala means daughter-in-law. So the idea that, the connection between the father-in-law and the daughter-in-law, may be different than some other erva through marriage connections is something to think about. That's number one. At the same time, maybe it is also basis for what you were suggesting, which is just because Yibum sets aside the Isser of Eshes Ach, is it so clear that like a secondary Yibum, like a father Kodem Matan Torah, that would set aside Kalaso? And the difference may be either from the father-son difference or from the sister-in-law, daughter-in-law difference, including what I just said, which is that when the Torah speaks about the erva of a sister-in-law, it doesn't call her a sister-in-law. It doesn't say Yavama. We only use the term Yavam and Yavama in the context of Yibum. Otherwise, the Torah doesn't use a term for wife of a brother or sister-in-law. It calls her Eshes Ach. But when it comes to daughter-in-law, we don't call her Eshes Haben. We call her Kalaso. So maybe the distinction is father versus son, or maybe the distinction in terms of whether you can violate an Isser or not, or maybe the distinction is sister-in-law versus daughter-in-law. So I think you could distinguish. The Rajba isn't distinguishing, but maybe the Ramban would. Let me go a step further. The Ramban, in his Perush al Torah, was troubled about why it is that Yehuda did not continue the relationship with Tamar. It says Velo Yasaf. Now, it's curious because the word Velo Yasaf in Hebrew can mean two opposite things. Velo Hosif, he didn't continue the relationship, or Velo Yasaf, meaning like Sof, he didn't end the relationship, meaning he continued it. And these two meanings are actually two views in the Gemara in Masechet Sota. The Gemara in Sota is not sure, like we say, Kol Gadol Velo Yasaf, about Ma'amad Har Sinai. So the Gemara in Sota has two deos, whether Yehuda ended his relationship with Tamar or he continued his relationship with Tamar. So the Ramban, in his Perush al Torah, says he terminated the relationship with Tamar, but he has a very difficult time explaining why, like what was wrong with the relationship. So in his Chidushim on Yevamos, the Ramban weighs in on that and says, oh, what was wrong with the relationship? What was wrong was that there was a better candidate, namely Sheila. Okay, and just because it was a better candidate means what? So maybe what it means is that even if there is a Yibum, the Yibum is more limited. Maybe it's limited to one encounter for the possibility of producing a child. So let me explain. The Netziv, in his commentary, Hamek Davar, both on Parshas Kitetse, which is the section that we've been reading, Ki Yeshu Achem Yachtav, etc., and in his discussion of Yehuda, Tamar, Shelah, Onan story in Parshas Vayeshev, in both places he says the following. He says, really, there are two tracks, there are two types of Yibum. Because if you look carefully at the pasuk in Kitetse, it says, Yavama, Yavo Aleha Ulakacha Lo Leisha V'Yibma. So Lakacha Lo Leisha sounds like he's marrying her. And that's where the Gemara knows that, if he does Yibum and then he decides that and then they decide they want to terminate the relationship, you don't do it through Chalitza, you do it through a get, because it's a regular marriage. Why? Because it says a Lakacha Lo Leisha. She becomes his regular wife. Even though the beginning of the relationship was Yibum, right? The conclusion of the relationship is Ishus. However, says the Netziv, and that's the norm, that's what most people think. However, says the Netziv, it also uses the language Yavamo Yavo Aleha B'Yibba. It's almost like the Torah, by using, two very different, expressions, is telling us that there's a choice how to do Yibum. You could do a narrow Yibum, which focuses on like a one-time possibility of Lahakim Zera or Lahakim Lachib Shem. That's what we mean, says the Netziv, when we say Yavamo Yavo Aleha V'Yibma. Or you could take the Zika, this Kesher, and you could turn it into Ulakacha Lo Leisha long-term, and he remains married to her. And if they want to leave that marriage, at that point, he would require a get. Says that it's if that's a choice.
Whoa, I'm sorry. Like the Netziv, the first choice is a one-shot deal. It's not a marriage.
It's a limited marriage, or a limited. It's a heter bia for the potential of producing an heir.
Right, but I thought we have learned Yavamasi before, but I thought that doesn't work. I mean, it's not supposed to be a
Well,
transactions.
you do have this in the Gemara in Daf Chaf. The Gemara says that if you have a case of Chai Be'Lavin mean, let's say, the Yibum of a Kohen Gadol.
There are
And-
cases of single yibum.
Yeah, of course.
Or
That's what I'm trying to say. And Almana. So the Gemara says in Daf Chaf that works. That's not only the problem of Eishasach, it's also the problem of
Almana
a Be'ula L'Kohen Gadol, right? So as a result, it's under the rubric of Aseh Dochalos Aseh. And since it's Aseh Dochalos Aseh, it's only going to apply when you have the mitzvah, and the mitzvah is only Bia Rishona. It's only one encounter with the possibility of producing a child. So the Gemara says, under those conditions, that's not a normal situation, where it's not just an Eishasach, but there's also Chai Be'Lavin, then what's permitted is only a limited encounter between the Yavam and the Yavam. What the Netziv is saying is that there's something like that built into every Yibum. That's a choice that the Yavam makes. I think it's a Chiddush, don't get me wrong. But
Gemara doesn't
anyway,
say-
I want to tell you one more thing that he says, then I'll take the question. Says the Netziv, maybe this would explain why Yehuda ended his relationship with Tamar, which the Ramban isn't, so comfortable with. Why? He says maybe these two paradigms of a long-term marriage and a short-term encounter, just for the sake of Lahakim Zera, maybe when it comes to a brother has the right to choose. It's about a brother that we say Ulakachal Isha. But when it comes to a father stepping in for a son/brother, which is the story of Yehuda, that is certainly a second level Yibum, even Kodah Matan Torah. Post Matan Torah, there's no such thing. Kodah Matan Torah, that was like a secondary level, not a prime level Yibum. Says that it's maybe the difference between secondary level and prime level is exactly this question. Namely, if you're dealing with the prime Yibum, it's a L'Kachal Isha, and it's a long-term relationship. But since Yehuda was a father and she was his daughter-in-law, it was only Bia Rishona. And for that reason, Torah says that he didn't continue, below Yosef, he didn't continue the relationship with her. So that's exactly how the Netziv, portrays it. There were some questions.
There's two issues here. Number one, it seems that in the Gemara, in every case that I remember, you have to have a get if you had even a Bia Rishona, right?
Yeah. No, either way you need a get. The question is,
No, so in other words, this idea that you could have that it's only a Yibum and it doesn't require a get, we don't seem to have any such examples in the Gemara that I remember.
no, either way you'd require a get. The question is whether the Yibum to begin with allows for a long-term relationship or it only allows for Bia Rishona. The Netziv is saying what we find in Chai Be'Lavin because of pressure and counter pressure is actually an option in all Yibum depending on the decision of the Yavam. Now that's a Chiddush, but that's what he says.
So
And then he goes on to say, however, in pre-Matan Torah, where the father, was a secondary option, he didn't have a choice. He only had a limited Yibum.
But if he in fact stopped after that, then he left Tamar almost like an aguna because nobody else could marry her so long as he had the zakuk, the relationship.
You would have to give her a get.
So if you're holding that it was a one-time situation, we're
I mean,
also
the heter is only one time. He still has to.
we're saying historically that he gave Tamar a get.
I think he
Otherwise,
is.
she'd be like an aguna, right?
Right. The answer is presumably yes.
We don't know, by the way, if Shayla ever. I guess Shayla was also to her at that point, right?
Yeah. She had two children. She had twins, but we don't know what happened to her marital life after that. Again, remember there are two days in the Gemara. One view in the Gemara in Sota is that she continued to, her marriage with Yehuda. We're just trying to explain why the Ramban thinks not, So in his chidushim, he tells you because he felt that Shela was a preferred. Okay, so that's the Ramban and that's the Rajba. The Ritva here also says, like the Ramban, that even if Yehuda did a kind of yibum Kodem Matan Torah, it was more because he was anticipating Matan Torah, but it wasn't a yibum gamor, and therefore if there had been a prohibition of kala, he wouldn't have been able to do it. But let me add something else. The Ramban, when he explained,
it's not logical because when he did it, he didn't know what he was doing.
and
The
therefore,
Torah didn't come into the picture with him when he did it. After the fact, it's a different story. When you
no, we're saying that tzadka mimeni, so it was a yibum, but it's still only a yibum without any sarkala, as opposed to like a regular yibum, which overrides the isur ve'shasach. That's what he said. So I want to go back to another point for a minute. The Ramban touches on his dispute with the Ramah is a very fascinating dispute, meaning do Bnei Noach have relatives through marriage or not? And does that engender a kind of an arayos? That's an interesting argument. So the Ramban says they don't, because the Torah uses the expression of kicha when it comes to arayos through marriage, and a ben doach doesn't have kicha. I just want to talk about that for a minute. And what I want to say about it is the following. You could understand the Ramban as make a technical point. I mean, the Ramban is trying to explain how he knows, based on the psukim, the remez, if you will, the hint in the psukim, that, really, Bnei Noach don't have expanded erba through marriage. Because otherwise the Torah wouldn't have used an expression, about that doesn't apply to Bnei Noach. But what I'd like to suggest is something more substantive. And that is that maybe the Ramban is telling us something very profound. Namely, that there's a connection between the expanded notion of family that creates even more relatives through marriage and the use of the term kicha, not just to signify that this is the case, but the way that it is signified. So let me explain. As we noted earlier, a ben Noach has marriage, but there's a fundamental difference between a ben Noach's marriage and a Jew's marriage. Ben Noach's marriage is primarily a bilateral relationship, and it's more about, a heter, ish ish. It's more about permitting, the intimacy and so on. That's what the Rambam discussed this many times. In the beginning of Hilchos Ishus, the Rambam says, Kodem Matan Torah, haya adam pogea isha b'shuk ratzahu ratztahi. If prior to Matan Torah and for Bnei Noach, if there's a consensual agreement, that these two are going to live together as husband and wife, that's good enough. You don't need what you need for a member of Klal Yisrael. Misha Nitna Torah, the Torah said that about Jews that you need erusin prior to Nisuin, and you need Eidei Kiyum, and you need witnesses. So what differentiates marriage of a ben Noach and marriage of a Yisrael? In part, erusin, kiddushin, lekicha, prior to their living together. In my opinion, that isn't just a small thing, that's a big thing. Meaning, what is it that erusin brings to the ishus? It brings long-term security and a formalized relationship and the chalos of Eishes Ish, as we've discussed many times. That's why you need two present witnesses to solemnize the rites, rites, between the husband and wife, because, more than, the agreement is taking place here. A new status with wide repercussions is being, formed and engendered in this context.
It's a matter of sanctity.
One second.
Non-sanctity.
What?
It's a matter of sanctity in the Jewish marriage versus no sanctity in the.
So it's a matter of sanctity, but it's also the sanctity expresses itself in the long-term security of the relationship. So it's not casual, it's not easy to terminate and so on. But also in kicha, in expanding family. Meaning, for Ben Noach, according to the Ramban, because the word kicha is absent, he doesn't gain relatives through marriage. But for a Jew, where the word kicha is used, what I'm suggesting is it not only reveals or signifies that he gets new relatives through marriage, it explains why. Meaning, marriage isn't just a bilateral heter of isha ish, it is a merging of families. And again, like I said before, according to Rav Hirsch, it's a chassan and a kala. It's, the bride and the groom are sons-in-law and daughter-in-law. It's almost like you're hitting us over the head, right, Rosh, that these families are merging. So the reason that there is a prohibition of kalaso and of achos ishto and so on is for the same reason that you require erusin kodim l'nesuin and you require edekiyum, namely because marriage isn't just a narrow bilateral relationship, it's the expansion of family. That's why Yibum can only really apply to Ishus of Yisrael. It can't really apply to Benoch, something that the Ramban concluded very decisively also in his parish on the Torah that we read last week.
Does the need of a ksuba highlight that?
What?
Does the need of a ksuba highlight that?
It does, in my view, for sure.
There's an obligation of the children to take care of the
that too, yeah. So basically, the idea that there's this expanded notion of family through marriage is something that highlights the transcendence of family. So that's what the Ramban, whether he meant it or not, I don't know. He might have just meant it in the narrower way. We use this expression, this is what it implies, and therefore it excludes Benoch. But what I would say is, precisely because we use the expression of kicha, and that and edekiyum demonstrate that we're dealing with a concept of transcendent status and family. So the impact of that is also to expand erva and kurva. And I'll add one more thing. The Gemara says in Kiddushin Samach Hamid Beis, we talked about it a lot last year, those of you who were here, that the principle of Hodas Balin Kamedim Dami does not apply to Kiddushin. Meaning if the husband and the wife say, listen, we got married, there weren't witnesses, but we both agree, it doesn't work. The Gemara says, why? You need Eid Kiyum. You need, witnesses to solemnize these rites. Why do you need that? So the Gemara says, because it's Chav Lachrini. What does Chav Lachrini mean? Meaning other people are affected by this marriage, and therefore the fact that the two of them agree it happened isn't enough. Who are the other people who are affected by the marriage?
The other relatives.
So Rashi in Kiddushin Samach Hamid Beis says the other people affected by the marriage are the relatives, through marriage, who now become Asur. The Rashba disagrees. We talked about it last year for other reasons. The Rashba says if a ger marries a gioris and there are no relatives, you wouldn't need Eid Kiyum. But I think the Rashba missed the point. I think what Rashi was trying to say was something profound, something very similar, not because it's similar to what I said, but I'm, let's say, inspired by Rashi. Meaning, what are we saying now? We're saying that the need for Eid Kiyum, the need for Erusin Kodem L'Nesuin, is substantively, not just as a remez, connected to the notion that Jewish family is expansive and that it generates relatives and that has consequences, right? So that's the pshat in Rashi. It doesn't matter if it's a ger or gioris. It's the same marriage. Before, in fact, there might not be additional relatives because there just aren't any. But the capacity of marriage to go beyond the bilateral is true for a ger shenasa gioris too. Even if practically it doesn't, have manifestations, it's still the same marriage. So in that respect, the expanded Hagdara of erva is a testament to the sanctity and to the expansiveness and the aspiration, if you will, of Jewish marriages. And maybe that's the pshat in the Ramban. That's what differentiates Benoach and Yisrael. But then I'd just like to go a step further. and that is everybody's asked this question. It's a strong question, and the question is stronger than at least the answers that I'm familiar with. And that is, how come on Yom Kippur at Mincha we read the Parsha of Arayos? Right. In the morning on Yom Kippur we read, the Avodas Yom Kippurim. That makes sense. In the afternoon, for some reason, we read Parshas Achrei Mos, the story of the Arayos, the list of Arayos. It seems so strange. So Balitosis and Megillah and so on, they make different suggestions. Some people like very pragmatic suggestions. Oh, everybody's in shul, everybody's dressed so nicely. You have to remind people, about tznius and what's asur and what's mutar. Okay. Or this is a very challenging area of human life. People are prone, to tripping up in this area. So on Yom Kippur, a day in which people are more committed and are more consistent about the seriousness of their commitment. So we remind them about Arayos because it's an opportune time. No, those are some of the answers and the type of answer that's given. I'm not saying no. I mean, these are answers given by great authority figures. But I'd like to suggest a slightly different answer. And that is, the whole day of Yom Kippur is about, Kulal Hashem. And it has implications, for the rest of the year, how we balance, the physical side of our existence with the commitment of, being all in, fully committed to Avodas Hashem. So on the day of Yom Kippur, we fast. All year round, we're not going to fast. But by fasting on Yom Kippur, that establishes our credentials. So one of the main figure on Yom Kippur, as we know, is the Kohen Gadol, who represents Kulal Hashem. But the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, Dafka has to be married. And he can only be married to one wife. Right? Because Beso Zu Ishto, when he says his vidui, right, he can't be single. When the Rambam wants to, when the Rambam wants to, establish this requirement, he doesn't say, oh, the Kohen Gadol needs to be married. He, matter-of-factly, includes it as part of the definition of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. He says the avoda can be done by the Kohen Gadol. The avoda can only be done by the Kohen Gadol who is nasui, on this day. Instead of saying, but the Kohen Gadol, a prerequisite, a condition, he's got to be married. It sounds like what the Rambam's telling us is his marriage on this day isn't just a requirement or an additional condition. It is like a defining aspect of his kahuna. And it's such a contrast, of course, to Catholicism, where the priests have to, practice celibacy. They have a very one-dimensional notion of sanctity, right? But in Yahadus, the Kohen Gadol, who's Kulal Hashem, and who presides on Yom Kippur, that, especially on Yom Kippur, he must be married. When he says vidui, he has to have what he calls skin in the game, stakes, he has to have a family. But more than that, for his own empathy and for his own humanity and for his own connection to physical life, he cannot be celibate. So I think it's very fascinating that Dafka on Yom Kippur, the Kriyas HaTorah and Mincha, is the Parsha of Arayos. When we open with the bracha of Birchas Erusin under the chuppah, the Masada Kedushin, the way the bracha reads is, Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al ha'arayos, v'asar lanu es ha'arusos, v'hitar lanu es ha'nesuos lanu ha'idei chuppah v'kiddushin. Then we say, Mekadesh Shema Yisrael, ha'idei chuppah v'kiddushin. This is what troubled the Rush and others, namely, how come the first thing that we say when we're in Birchas Erusin is Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al ha'arayos? But I think that the answer is, number one, it establishes standards. The fact that you can't marry, there are incestuous relationships, there are prohibited relationships. These standards, establish a principle of kedusha, like Rashi, quoting Chazal in Parshas Kedoshim Tiu, Prushim Mino Arayos. Kedusha is expressed by, having, a disciplined posture, being able to, hold back in some of your desires. That's one aspect of it. But I think there's another aspect of it, and that is that the Parsha of Arayos, I'm speculating, I haven't heard this from anyone, it's my speculation. The Parsha of Arayos has natural krovim, a daughter, a mother, a sister, but it also has, as we know, a goodly number of arayos through marriage, right? The two sisters-in-law, meaning Eshes, Achiv, the wife of his brother, Achos, Ishto, the sister of his wife, right? The mother-in-law, the stepmother, all those are marital, expanded relatives and arayos. So when we say Asher Kedushanim B'Tzos V'Tzivano, in addition to saying, you're not allowed to marry these people, for sure. Number two, Ishus has standards. Kol makom shatamotze, kedusha tamotze, prisha, for sure. But I think there's a third element, and that is what we're saying is this kicha, as the Ramban points out, also expands erva. So the tzivano al arayos, in a way, is a testament to the notion that a marriage can create family. That's a very remarkable idea. It's not just a bilateral connection. So if that's the case, maybe on Yom Kippur, when we're talking about Kedusha, and especially as accentuated by the Kohen Gadol Nasui, who presides over everything, maybe the Parsha of Arayos, is very much emblematic of what different dimensions of Kedusha are really all about. Okay, so anyway, that is in terms of the Ramban. We have another couple of minutes, so I want to turn my attention to the Sfara. So there's another, Parshan who, as I say, makes a splash. At least for me, it makes a splash in terms of his presentation of Yibum. Just 1 second. And that is the Sforno. So the Sforno says something quite remarkable. And it can be found, I'm just trying to find it in my pages here. In my pages, it's on page 2 of the old Marmakomos. I'm not up to the new Marmakomos yet. So on page 2, this is what the Sforno says. V'lo yimachesh shemo Yisrael, pasuk vav. Everybody have that? Or those who are interested in looking in? Yeah?
Yes.
Is it page 2?
It is page 2.
Okay, great. So page 2, pasuk vav, the Torah says that, you should do Yibum. And if you do Yibum, v'lo yimachesh shemo Yisrael, then the deceased will not, be obliterated. His presence in some way will be secure. So this is what the Sforno says. Sheyia havlad nechshav etzel Hashem yis'aleh kiyum pirya v'rivya l'meis. Shaharei nolad al yidei kiddushin shel meis. So what is he saying? He says if the Yavam, brother-in-law, right, does his, preferred obligation, namely to complete the Zika and to do Yibum, and then they have a child, so this child will be perceived as being an extension or as being related to the erusin, the kiddushin of the deceased brother himself. Meaning, unlike the Ramban, who sees the child as kind of spiritual continuity of the deceased on a mystical basis, Gilgul Neshamos, the Sfarnos sees it as connected to the mace on a purely legal and halachic basis. And what he's saying is as follows. How come Yibum doesn't require an equivalent of erusin? It looks like you get away with only nisuin, right? Because how do you consummate the Yibum? Yivama yavo aleha, right? The Yibma. So the Lakachal Isha is through a Maisabia alone. But regular Ishas from scratch requires two elements. It requires erusin and nisuin. Where's the erusin in Ibum?
Isn't the Zakuka the Erison?
What?
Isn't the fact that she becomes Zakuka to her to
So
him?
there are different ways to explain this.
Erison
example,
is
the Rambam-
dead brother, the dead brother.
So the Rambam, for example, says hikna lo min hashamayim. That's the Rambam solution.
That's the Zakuka, that's the Erison.
The Zika, but not necessarily the dead brother's erusin.
No, so I'm saying the Erison does actually take place, so we don't have to go back to the dead
Hikna lo min
brother.
hashamayim, if you hold like the Rambam. But what the Sforno is saying, and it has earlier roots in Rashi and Tosas, but the Sforno takes it considerably further. I'll explain what I mean by that next week, hopefully. Just to remind everybody, next week there's a rally in Washington, which is very strongly being urged, for people to participate, to show our, enthusiastic support of the, the right of Israel to defend itself, and our, horror at the atrocities in the attack, and therefore, producing a large crowd is considered to be important. So my plan is to be in Washington next week. So the question is, how does that fit with the shiur at 7:30? So for now, we're going to I'll try to get back to Jacob once my specific plans, like how I'm getting there and back, are better defined. But, we are going to try to have the shiur next week at 7:30. Anyway, I hate to miss a shiur. So if worse comes to worse, I will try to do it in transit, either by Zoom or just calling in, by audio, so we can continue next week. If for some reason that is not doable, and I know in advance, I'll let Jacob know. And if it's not doable last minute because the technology doesn't work, or the background noise, is too much, so you'll excuse me. But we're going to try to make the effort, to keep the shiur going. I am scheduled to be in Israel in a few weeks, so that, then we'll have a break then. But just to let everybody know. Anyways, the Sforno takes the position, not hikna lo min hashamayim, but that the deceased brother's erusin continues, right, to exist on some level. By the way, that's how he interprets the words Eshes Hames. Instead of thinking Eshes Hames means, the previous wife of the deceased, meaning describing, a past relationship, according to the Sforno and others who interpret this way, Eshes Hames is quite literal, meaning she's still, again, in a typical marriage where there's no closure problems and no additional zika or agenda, we say that ha'isha kones atzma b'misa sabal. That's the first mission on Masachet Kiddush. However, according to this perspective, when there are closure issues, because the husband doesn't have an heir, so then she continues to be Eshes Hames on some level, and the erusin of the deceased is the background that allows, Yibum to take place with only the equivalent of a nesu. So that's not hikna lo min hashamayim. That is, and that's what the Sforno is describing here. But the Sforno is going considerably further, because he's not trying to explain. That's what the words Eina Yabam Tzarich Lekadsha Kiddushin Acherin. He's saying, how come the Yavam can get away with only a Nesuin and not with an Erison? The answer is because he's working against the background of the Erison of the deceased. But he's saying more than that. He's saying, and if there's a child that is produced based on this hybrid marriage, namely the Erison of the mace and the Nesuin and the physical, fathering of the Yavam, so that child, legally, halachically, will be partially associated with the mace. That's what we mean when we say, it's quite remarkable. He's saying the Puri of Arivia, and by the way, the use of the term Puri of Arivia is a problem, or at least is an issue. We'll see others do it as well, but it's not at all obvious. The words Puri of Arivia do not appear in the Parsha of Yibum. Lahakim Zera La'achiv, but it doesn't say anything about Puri of Arivia. Lahakim Shem La'achiv in Parshas Kitetse. Puri of Arivia Man Dekar Shema, it's not mentioned. There's no Mishnah, there's no Gemara that explicitly speaks about Puri of Arivia for Yibum, but we do find a few Rishonim, and we're going to discuss it, who connect Puri of Arivia to Yibum. But as the Aruch LaNer points out on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, it's a problem, it's an issue, because it's not the norm, it's not the classical Puri of Arivia. It just doesn't follow those norms. For example, in order to, a man is obligated to pursue the mitzvah, Puri of Arivia, as long as he doesn't have, the way we paskin, a son and a daughter. So let's say the mace had a daughter, or a grandchild, or a son, but he didn't have a son and a daughter. Would there be any yibum?
Oh,
Certainly not, right? Ubain ein lo, and on the contrary, we say ein lo ayin alav. Even if there's like a grandchild, let's say the children are deceased, but there's a grandchild out there. Even then, there's no yibum.
And what about
the Aruch
modern
LaNer
times,
says,
if the Met had donated his zera to a bank and the opportunities for him to actually have a child that is his?
They didn't have banks in those days.
that is a very interesting question. Obviously that technology was not available, but that is a very interesting question. We could talk about that. Some of the modern poskim do speak
can I
about
ask
that.
a simple question? If
Yeah.
if we take it technically that the child belongs to the mace, would we
Or
say
partially at least.
would we say then that the child is a cousin to his? In other words, is the child
In terms of kurva,
yeah?
no, I don't think so. There's no evidence for such a thing. But that's a good way of highlighting exactly what both of you were just saying. So when we use this phrase "Puri of Arivia," the Aruch LaNer at minimum is pointing out. Aruch LaNer is saying two important things. Number one, where did Puri of Arivia come from in the psukim and the gemaras? That's A. Number two, you can't take it literally because it's not the normal application of Puri of Arivia. Nonetheless, the Sforno is telling us that that's what it means when we say lahakim zera or lahakim shem laachiv, and that's what the words mean. Shavlad nechshav etz Hashem yisala kiyum Puri of Arivia lemeis shari nolan ayidei kiddusha shomeis the ena yavam tzarich lekadsha kiddushin acherin. He says v'zeh mo'as onan b'sinaso esachiv v'bezos hayalav katzah. Onan said, I'm not going to marry Tamar and produce and father a child, because if I do that, the child is partially credited to my brother, and I don't want that. Wow. If you look in Parshas Vayeshev, the Sforno there, or no, before that, the Sforno in the next pasuk says, "Kacha yasel isha shaloi banez beis achiv, ra'uihu lozeh habizayon." He says he deserves this bizayon. Ma'achar shelo chafetz lahashlim binyan abayis shehitchil livnos achiv b'kiddushin. Chalitza is like a betrayal.
Yes.
Because he could partner with his brother, provide the Nesuin to his Erison, and then also provide him with a miktsas legacy of a child. And instead he refuses to complete the building if you look at the Sforno in Parshas Vayeshev,
Whoa, we learned Yibam is only good if it's totally Lishma. It's better to go with
that
Chalitza.
is the view of
No.
Abba Shaul. That's the view of Abba Shaul.
The
Yeah.
Gemara says that Yibum is good under any circumstance.
Well, the question is whether we paskin like Abba Shaul, and either way, who says we're talking about an absence of sincerity? Or you're asking, you mean, according to Abba Shaul, why should we be upset with, with Onan? If he wasn't Lishma, then he shouldn't do it. Okay, good question. If you hold like Abba Shaul. Okay. Anyways, the Ramban, the Sforno rather, in Parshas Vayeshev, this is on page 5.
By the way, Abba Shaul's concern was the opposite. Not that somebody wouldn't want to do it. His concern that somebody would do it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, that's also true. Mishum Yofi, Mishum other things.
Yeah.
Correct. Anyways, the Sforno on the bottom of the page, Ki lo yazera, or zara, yada shelo haya hu levado hazocha b'kol osa mitzvah. Ona knew that he wouldn't be the sole credit, wouldn't get the sole benefit or credit of this mitzvah of producing a child. Because the child would be associated with the erison of his brother.
It sounds more like
Zoche b'miktsasa. He didn't want to share with his brother. He didn't want to share the legal, credit for the child with his brother.
that's different than the assumption earlier that it would be totally on the legacy of.
No, he didn't say totally, but he didn't say totally before. Here he says
like this is more like a partnership.
Right. But either way, it's a very so I'm gonna have to pick up with this next week because I have to
read
speak somewhere,
as
but
being materialistic his reasons.
I'm sorry.
Is this being read as his reasons for not kayeming his chovah, that it is because of material gain for his own offspring?
I don't think it's material. I think it's even more than that. I think it's like, he didn't have this, sense of commitment to his brother, and he was selfish. In general, the way Chazal understood both Er and Onan is that they were, very egocentric and self-aggrandizing. And that's one of the reasons that they didn't want to marry Tamar. And they didn't want to do this chesed for their brother. I don't think it's a question of material. Maybe it had been material gain, but there is some material gain, at least in terms of
Yes,
Yerusha.
for his own children.
Yeah, but either way, what I want to pick up with next time is this idea of the Sforno. So number one, what does Piri Veribia have to do with anything? We'll see that Chuvas Arajba also quotes Piri Veribia. Number two, what does it mean if it doesn't mean the normal, classical Piri Veribia? Number two, what does it mean that Piri Veribia is associated with Ishus and Erison in general? Not such a simple matter. What are the implications of that? And number three, if the erison of the brother was still a factor, how come the violation of Zika is only a lav and not a chiyav misa? She's an Eishes Ish.
Yeah.
You don't have to be Nesua for Eishes Ish. You only have to be Arusa. So that's something else I want to talk about.
Violating Yibum is
A lav.
a love only.
If I'm talking about if a third party, yeah, if she's hamei, if the Eishes Hameis is achutza leizar, that's a lav. It's not misa.
Right.
But according to those who think that she's still Eishes, ha'ach. So I want to talk. I don't think it's such a problem, but I think you need to point out something. So I want to speak more about the Sforno. Then I want to speak about whether you make a bracha on Yibum, whether you make a bracha on Chalitza, whether the Yavama is obligated in Yibum or only the Yavam, whether the Yavam is obligated in Chalitza. I want to speak about a few more of those things on the Sefer HaChinuch. You should hold on to both Mar Makomos, and Amir Hashem, we will continue, hopefully next week in some capacity, if it's possible.
Okay. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.